Great. So I just want to first welcome Janice Finley and the rest of the class who's able to join us today, and also Karen Terra Godoy, who is our teaching assistant this term, and what a thrill to have her with us as well. Karen also will be presenting in week 13 on disability and culture. So it's going to be really nice to have two guest speakers in this class. I want to first start with a land acknowledgement, and we respect the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And I want to give a very brief introduction to Janice, and she will introduce herself as well and her focus. And so this is just from some information that Janice shared with me and also from the course site. So this week, week 6, we're going to focus on a topic often missing from both disability discourse and mainstream sexual education, the intersection of disability and sexuality. So using a critical disability studies perspective, we're going to look at cultural, political, and structural forces and how they influence who is regarded as sexually legitimate, capable, and autonomous. So, Janice, I will leave the rest up to you to
Thank
construct
you.
as you wish.
And how long do I have, Margaret?
I have the session booked for an hour, and I booked it for an hour and a half just in case we have any additional questions. So,
Okay, sounds good.
whatever works for you.
Okay, great. All right, I'm just going to share my screen and we will go into presenter mode. Now, hopefully you're seeing the right screen. Great, awesome. Well, thanks for having me. So good morning, everyone. My name is Janice. I use she, her pronouns. I will give a bit more of an introduction about myself in a minute. But today we're going to talk about disability and sexuality, or sometimes it's called disabled sexuality. And we will be talking about some sensitive subjects. So please take care of yourself at any point. You're welcome to turn your camera off or take a break. Just do what you need to do. So my land acknowledgement here. I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, which is Treaty 6 territory. And I currently make my home in Calgary, which is located on the traditional lands of Treaty 7. So here I live, work, and play, especially in the mountains that nourish me so much. But I'd also like to acknowledge my connection to the lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, where I lived for most of 2023, where I was attending classes at University of Victoria. So having lived in different places, I try to learn about and reflect on the histories and contributions of Indigenous people in these regions, and I'm very grateful for the privilege of living on these lands and so close to the mountains. Bit of an agenda for today. I have a lot to go through, but it is about an hour of content, and please stop at any point if you want to ask questions. We can also do questions at the end. I'm pretty flexible. And if I'm going too fast, just let me know, but I have lots prepared today. So about me, I'm a student at the University of Victoria. I'll get into that in a minute. But I live with a genetic connective tissue disorder called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I've lived with chronic pain since 2006. I've had, I think, 5 major surgeries in the last 5 years. Yeah. And over 20 rounds of prolotherapy and other injections and lots of procedures. So in my case, it's an invisible dynamic disability. And my experiences shape my understanding of the complexities of chronic pain, disability, and sexuality. And my body and sexuality have been influenced by factors like chronic pain, body dysmorphia, eating disorder recovery, as well as past experiences of sexual assault. So I engage in modeling and advocacy as well to challenge societal perceptions around disabled sexuality. And this is me here for a photo shoot. The zebra is a symbol for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and rare diseases. So professionally, my background's not actually in disability studies. I'm a registered nurse of 11 years, and I've been specializing in sexual health since 2016. I'm currently doing my PhD in the Social Dimensions of Health program at UVic. I'm also the president of the Alberta Society for the Promotion of Sexual Health. Other disclosures, I'm a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Scholar, and I have CHR Canada Graduate Doctoral Research Scholarship. And I'm also an expert advisory committee member for Statistics Canada on sexual and reproductive health. So my research and advocacy really reflect my dual perspective and the privileges that I hold as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual woman, and the challenges I face as a woman with a disability and chronic pain. So my PhD research is a narrative inquiry, so qualitative research into people that live with chronic pain and how they experience sexuality as well as their sexual partners, and mostly focusing on experiences accessing healthcare related to chronic pain and sexuality. And so I really am aiming to destigmatize conversations about sexuality and disability through my research, education, and public engagement. And Margaret, just let me know if anything comes up in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it as well.
Sure, okay. Yeah, I'll watch that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so to talk about this, we have to think about, well, what do you picture in your mind when you think of someone who's sexy? And you don't have to share unless you feel comfortable, but if you want to put something in the chat, I'd love to hear what first comes to your mind when you think, okay, what's sexy to me? What makes someone sexy? What makes me sexy? You, obviously. Don't tell me what you think of me. Yeah, it's okay. I don't see anything, but really, I just want you to reconsider maybe some assumptions you have as we go through this lecture. And when I think about it, to me, sexy is an energy, not a body type. So we need to keep that in mind going forward. I don't know if you immediately thought, oh yeah, disability is sexy. I don't know. But what if disabilities were sexy? And I love this quote from McCruer, who I'll talk about later. What if disabled people were understood to be both subjects and objects of a multiplicity of erotic desires and practices, both within and outside the parameters of heteronormative sexuality? So this is a bit of an older article here, but we know that representation is important. And so on this slide, we see a paraplegic woman in a boudoir kind of photo. So, portrayed as sexy, right? Very a little bit intimate and sensual, which is great. Representation is important. My only issue with this photo is that she's still very much the heteronormative image of sexy, other than you can see she has a catheter bag. She's slim, she's white, she's blonde. And so this image almost perpetuates the attitude that it's okay to be disabled as long as you're beautiful and symmetrical. So going forward, the images I have on these slides are going to be a bit more representative of the disabled population. So what I did was, I'm in a Facebook group for people with disabilities, and the focus is anybody can talk about sex. It's mostly people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And so I posted and said, hey, I'm doing this lecture. Feel free to send me a photo where you feel sexy and one sentence about how your disability affects your sexuality. And so they've all consented to be here on the slides that you see. And this is from Jordan. And he says his answer was, sparing details. We have to be very careful so I don't have any dislocations or the like. And my partner is physically disabled as well. The worst part, though, are the very, very intrusive questions that happen when I mention she uses a wheelchair. So before we get into the sexy stuff, let's establish some facts, right? So chronic pain is the most common disability in Canada. It is recognized as a disease in its own right, and it can be disabling itself or associated with another disability. So 1 in 5 Canadians live with chronic pain. That's about 8 million people. And it predominantly affects women, who we know sexuality has been neglected in the research. And only in recent decades has women's sexuality really been researched beyond reproduction. 27% of Canadians aged 15 or older, which is a bit more than 1 in 4, had one or more disabilities that limited them in their daily activities. And that's a 2022 statistic. When we look at the different types of disabilities that are more common in youth, so 15 to 24, mental health related was the most common type of disability, followed by learning and pain related. For adults aged 25 to 64, The most common types of disabilities were pain-related, mental health-related, and flexibility. And then when we look at seniors, pain-related mobility are the most common, followed by flexibility. And one thing I want to point out with seniors, they still have sex, okay? Some seniors do. Sex is a thing that happens across the lifespan, but nearly half of seniors with a disability had 4 or more co-occurring disabilities. And then youth and working age adults, 2 or 3 was reported. And this is, again, an image from somebody in that group. And he has classical Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is one of the types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Okay, and this may be a review, but we should just touch base on how we define disability. And you've probably learned about some of the models of disability at this point. So the medical model sees disability as more of an individual problem. So something is located in the body that needs fixing. When we look at the social model of disability, it tends to shift the focus to how society disables people through things like inaccessibility, prejudice, and stigma. And the World Health Organization frames disability as a dynamic interaction between all of these factors. So really seeing disability as socially constructed and shaped by stigma and prejudice. So most of the research, recent research prefers the social model. That's kind of where we're at now, but we still can't ignore the role of impairment in the body in our lives. So when we look at sexuality in this context, these models determine whether sexuality is treated as risk and dysfunction or as pleasure and rights. So recognizing disability is socially constructed opens up space to talk about desire, agency, and intimacy rather than just medical limitations. But sexuality issues still vary widely. So a one-size-fits-all model doesn't always work. And it is important not to lose sight of the differences between different groups and individuals in the disabled community, because it can determine different issues around sexuality. Okay, so then we have to look at what is sexuality and how do we define that? And sexuality isn't just the act of having sex. It's also not just sexual orientation, which is sometimes what I hear from people when I talk about my research. So on the left here is the WHO's working definition of sexuality. But basically, it's the way people experience and express themselves sexually. And it's all of the things you see here on the slide on the right. This is the sexuality wheel. And so really, sexuality is a central aspect of being human throughout life. And I do want to point out this wheel here. All of the little boxes contribute to sexuality, but there's not a section for health status, which I find fascinating, unless you put it under like maybe experiences. But having a disability affects many of these aspects of sexuality, like relationships, body image, self-image, values, personality. And it can be very disembodying having a disability, and that can affect body image. Okay, so then we have to think about, well, what's sex? So we have to reimagine what sex is here. And this is a drawing from someone from the group. But how do you define sex? What's intimacy? And I'm not talking about sex assigned at birth. So for disability communities, it's really about reimagining what we think sex is. So questions I like to ask are, why should men be dominant in sex? Why should sex revolve around penetration? Why should sex only involve 2 people? Why can't disabled people be assisted to have sex by third parties? And what's normal sex? So when you look at the literature, it's really about thinking outside this charmed circle of sex, as one of the researchers calls it, that marks an able-bodied disabled divide in terms of particular bodies and practices. So outside of this normate sex term. Just as HIV and the invention of safer sex challenged gay men to use their imagination and find new and different ways of having sex, so too the limitations of impairment can create different options, not just close down possibilities. So we can look at alternative pleasures and intimacy depending on the disability. And in cancer patients, removing the focus on penetration can allow for slower, more intimate sexual play. And disabled people or anybody can actually experience abstract orgasms. So that would be like an erotic sensation, an orgasm from alternate parts of bodies and minds. And so sex is often more about physical pleasure as well. It can be, people often seek it for intimacy, warmth, validation, and connection. So I always ask, well, does intimacy have to include sex as well? And, looking at sex and disability, sex isn't necessarily vital to happiness, but a healthy sex life is a right if desired. And so private desires and relationships really need to be and should be part of the disability rights conversation. And we'll talk a bit more about the concept of sexual citizenship and accessibility later. Okay, so before I continue, I'm curious, how many of you have ever had your family doctor bring up sex or sexuality without you prompting? And you can just put it in the chat. Never. Yeah, unsurprising. Oh, okay, yes, great. That's fantastic. Yes, awesome. Okay, cool. So things are changing maybe. That's great. Great. Okay. So I'll talk about healthcare in a bit. Um, but yes, we know that sexuality is linked to quality of life, identity, and relational health, but it remains one of the most neglected aspects of disability and chronic pain care. So up to 81% of people with chronic pain do report sexual concerns, but few receive support. And when addressed, sexuality is often reduced to function or fertility, ignoring pleasure, intimacy, and identity. So only 14.2% of health professionals routinely ask about sexuality or provide related information. And that was a 2021 study. It's a little bit better in oncology, where about 25% of providers ask, but so it's worse in cardiology, which I find a little bit surprising. So only about 8% of providers in cardiology ask about this because, I mean, some sexual activity can be cardiovascularly demanding. So, but then we look at why. So about a quarter report receiving training on sexuality and disability, which leaves 75% of healthcare providers saying, no, I didn't get any training on sexuality and disability. There's lack of confidence, they say, competence, and then time. So, especially when working with people who have complex conditions, chronic pain, and visible disabilities. And so these gaps reinforce our biomedical focus on dysfunction rather than a rights based, pleasure affirming approach to care. So, people with disabilities can be vulnerable. They do experience sexual violence at 2 to 3 times the rate of non disabled people. And that's really connected to power and vulnerability. So, when bodies are desexualized or viewed as dependent, consent and autonomy often get blurred or dismissed. We sometimes also see higher rates of substance use and risk taking in disability populations, usually when it's tied to unaddressed trauma, stigma, or pain. And when trauma and pain are silenced through stigma, people may seek connection and escape through less safe or unsupported ways. So, for many years, I worked as a partner notification nurse for the provincial sexually transmitted infection program in Alberta. And so I would do case management and I would also do contact tracing. So, somebody who either tests positive for an STI or has been named as a contact, meaning they came in contact with the person who tested positive, I would let them know and contact those people. And what we know with STI rates is certain populations have much, much higher rates of STIs, and that includes Indigenous people. And that's because we look at structural oppression and things like trauma and pain, and that can be correlated to substance use to cope with that, which can lead to less safe decision making around sexual practices. So disability, pain, trauma, there's links there that can be explored. So these myth clinical conversations, though, can lead to unaddressed distress and trauma, relationship strain, loss of sexual self. And so when sexuality is ignored, we see inequities in care and pleasure and safety that deepen further, especially for women, queer, visibly disabled populations, and other marginalized populations. So silencing sexuality in a way takes away power and it keeps pleasure out of the conversation and leaves pain unacknowledged. But by bringing sexuality back into healthcare, it's about restoring agency and affirming that everyone deserves pleasure and safety, not just basic function or survival. Okay, so there, I know you had some readings, and the first one listed here was already in your course syllabus. I'm not going to go over all of the next slides, but they do summarize some key points from the assigned readings for those of you that may not have had a chance to do them. And I did ask for one extra one to be added there. Before I continue, does anyone have any questions about these two readings? Oh, I see something. Thanks. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Margaret. So I really like the McGrath one. And so I've got some summary slides, but I won't go into detail too much. I'll be kind of referencing them as I go along. But this is just a summary you can read through if you didn't have a chance to read the article. And these are some of the key points that McGrath does talk about. And then and this is the other article. One thing I do want to mention, I really like this expression, and this is from Dr. Shanif Esmail at the University of Alberta, who I know, and I think actually one of his papers was on the reading list for this week. He said once in one of our lectures, he said, "We're all tabs, temporarily able-bodied people in society," and I really appreciated that. So there's kind of an hierarchy of bodies that exists in historical, cultural, structural, and global contexts throughout history. And so if we're looking at disability and sexuality, we have to kind of look at, okay, well, we have to understand the degree to which one's body is devalued is also affected by other social characteristics like social class, sexual orientation, age, race, ethnicity. And so the type of disability itself can often also be in this hierarchy. So whether it's visible or not, how severe is it? Is it physical or mental? And these contexts can mediate the degree to which a person with like a less normative abled body is socially compromised. And so I'll talk about intersectionality a little bit later, but an issue with it is what we call disability hierarchy, where it's like, oh, Janice, you're not disabled enough to belong to our community. Like you're functioning. So, we don't want you in our community. And so invisible disabilities, where the condition isn't obvious and doesn't automatically, it's not visible to a stranger, can often be really devalued and not seen as enough of a disability to belong to certain communities. So I'll skip through these here. But then we come to the term disabled sexuality. And I see this as interchangeable with disability and sexuality separately. But if you get interested in this topic, it might be a term that you see. So, disabled sexuality refers to the sexual experiences, expressions, identities, and needs of people with disabilities. There's some key aspects listed on the slide here. Really, what it does is it emphasizes the importance of recognizing and respecting the sexual rights and experiences of people with disabilities. So, promoting inclusivity and ensuring that they have the support and resources to fully express and enjoy their sexuality. So, that includes physical and emotional dimensions, sexual identity and expression, interpersonal relationships, access to sexual health and education, social and cultural context, and then advocacy and empowerment. Okay. But I do want to point out, and with disability in general, but also disabled sexuality isn't about overcoming disability. A lot of disabilities can't be overcome. It's about expanding the possibilities of sex, intimacy, and attraction beyond the dominant able-bodied heteronormative narrative. So, as Shakespeare, a researcher, current researcher Shakespeare, not old-timey literature Shakespeare, the problem of disabled sexuality isn't how to do it, but who to do it with. And it's really about how disabled people are creating new ways of being erotic, desirable, and powerful on their own terms. So challenging norms about this able-bodied identity that's considered often more naturalized and just assumed. And actually, this able-bodied identity, I would say, is more naturalized and assumed than even heterosexual identities. I think we've come a long ways with queer rights, but sometimes we still forget that a lot of people are disabled. And so you're like, oh, what's sexy? I don't know. You picture maybe a queer person, but do you picture a disabled person? I don't know. So societal barriers, not physical bodies, are really the primary challenge to disabled people's sexual expression. And so disabled people have different conceptions of what erotic means and can explore new sexual temporalities and even diverse gender and sexual identities. So even though there's many challenges, disabled individuals can still live healthy, adventurous, and satisfying sexual lives if they choose to do so. But surprisingly, well, maybe not, there's a lot of curiosity that isn't always warranted. So disabled people are frequently asked, well, what exactly do you do and how do you do it about their sex lives? Similar to how many queer people have historically been questioned. So I had somebody tell me, I can't believe how often this comes up. So they're a wheelchair user and they're like, yeah, I can tell you it's not uncommon where, say, they're in an elevator and a stranger looks at them and says, well, how do you have sex? And I'm like, I'm sorry. Would you ask somebody that's not in a wheelchair that? Why is it okay to ask them? That's a very personal question from a stranger, right? So the issue isn't really how disabled people have sex, but who they have it with, how they do it with those people. But this is because society stigmatizes it that it's such an issue. So, disabling sex is very empowering for people because it signifies then a process that is challenging, resistant, but even sexy because it can disrupt these traditional ideas of sexual identity. Okay, great. We're going to take a pause here and watch a short video. And I'm just going to make sure the audio will come through okay. Should be okay, I think. Let me know. Oh, no sound. Okay, that's because I have to change some kind of setting. So I forget how to do this. There's a way. Audio. How do I do this? Mm, Ooh, there's a way to do this. How do I do this? Mm, Share computer sound. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna try this. Okay, let's go back.
People with disabilities, they go through all the things that the able-bodied community go through. They have financial hardship, they lose jobs, they have children, they have wives, they go through marital problems, all of these things. So it's really, really great to be a part of a show that explores those things. We'd spoken a lot about that scene together. So, Emma and I, Laurie, the writers, the directors, the intimacy coordinators, and we just wanted to really get it right. Because obviously, that the cultural significance of that scene. And we came to the conclusion that it's so much more freeing if Isaac is a complete expert in himself, because that is just such a great thing for people with disabilities to see. I think that's really important culturally, and it's nice to be able to portray that. It's showing disability in a light that we haven't seen it before. Isaac's not this angelic figure that always does the loveliest things. He's a bit of an arse, let's say. Yeah, I think that's the most refreshing thing, is that he feels real. He feels like something we haven't seen before. You're valid. You don't need to apologize for your existence. You are a human being. You're a sexual being. So feel more than free to, discuss these things, because you don't need to apologize for existing, which I feel is probably the most freeing thing to be told, is that you're valid. And I'm really happy that I can portray Isaac in a way that makes people feel valid. Tu ne devrais jamais donner à quelqu'un le pouvoir de tuer.
So yeah, if you've ever seen Sex Education, I really appreciate as a show. I feel like it is quite well done in terms of some of the issues around exploring sexuality. I think it's really well done. Yes. And the cool thing about this actor, George Robson, is he actually is a wheelchair user. So he's not just portraying one in the show, which is starting to become more common, but still very, very rare, where it's actually a disabled person portraying a disabled person. So it's a really cool. Okay, moving on. Okay, so some of our current issues. This is actually a quote that is the same age as me, from disability activist Anne Finger. And she wrote this more than a decade ago, well, many decades ago now. Geez, I guess I'm getting old. Is an assertion now well known in the disability rights movement. So sexuality is often the source of our deepest oppression. It's also often the source of our deepest pain. It's easier to talk about and formulate strategies for changing discrimination in employment, education, and housing than it is to talk about our exclusion from sexuality and reproduction. And I think this is still very valid today, actually. So we're going to talk about this. I really like quotes, so there's a lot of them in here. But essentially, yes, it seems disability has been left out of the conversation for years around sex and sexuality, and the stigma of sexuality and the stigma of disability, and then when you put them together, is still very much there. So why is that? Well, society equates youth with health and tends to limit discussions about sex and disability to healthy young people. And so we forget about older people or people with disabilities or anything like that. If you're healthy and you're young, you're having sex, but apparently you're not in any other version of that. So there's a lot of stereotypes and stigmatization. So people with disabilities are often seen as weak, passive, and dependent. And do we think that that is typically associated with being sexy? No, we don't often in our society. So the languaging we have can contribute to this stigma. When we think about the terms we use for people with disabilities, we say you're deformed, you're disabled, you're abnormal, you're invalid. And often disability as a primary identity can overshadow other aspects of a person's identity, especially in sexual contexts. People with disabilities are often perceived as lacking sexual desire, asexual, unable to perform sexually, or just uninterested in sex. And that's an assumption that happens sometimes. So what happens is medical practitioners often don't provide sexual health care to people with disabilities because of this misconception. Or for disabled women, for example, there's kind of an infantilization where they're seen as dependent, incapable, socially isolated, and that limits their roles as sexual partners or mothers and how we see them. And then there's sexual marginalization. So people with disabilities are often marginalized in sexual relationships. They can be less respected and less likely to receive consent. And then there's still a bit of a negative focus in the literature. So a lot of the literature on disability and sexuality focuses on abuse, consent, capacity, and sex work, although I argue that sex work doesn't always have to be negative, rather than positive aspects of sexuality. And I love this photo. This is from, she called it pole dancing because her pole is, I think it looks like an Intero feed or something, but like an IV tubing situation. She's like, yeah, I'm pole dancing. Very cute. So it's often a difficult topic for people to communicate about sex. And then you add disability on top of that. And so healthcare professionals may not always feel skilled and confident in talking about it. People in a relationship that have a disability might lose confidence and assume that, a romantic relationship is now out of the question if they are single. Existing relationships can also suffer, especially if maintaining intimacy is challenging. I was listening to, Alice Wong wrote a book, or there's a bunch of essays called Disability Intimacy. And one of the authors was saying intimacy is really a litmus test of a relationship when one of them has a disability. So studies show that people with chronic pain are more likely to experience difficulties with sex than those without pain and to be more anxious about it. So over time, if you're anxious or pain before or during sex, or it could lead to a flare up, and may mean that, like any other activity, if it causes you pain or anxiety, you might reduce how often you do it or avoid it altogether. And so some of the studies show that, okay, people with pain and sexual concerns will still do it for their partner rather than because they're enjoying it. So again, with current issues, I hope my message is getting through, but heterosexuality is still privileged. It's perceived as normative under patriarchal assumptions, and people are still very much viewed through a binary gender and heteronormative lens. And this limits sexual expression assumptions and ideas that are very goal-oriented around penetration and reproduction. And what if you fit outside of that? So we also don't have a lot of research. So existing research often excludes people with disabilities around sexuality. Addresses still a very small number of specific chronic illnesses and tends to focus on erectile function while neglecting broader aspects of sexuality. The sexuality and disability studies that are out there often are in the context of cancer research or focused on people with intellectual disabilities and issues of consent. So pleasure and sexual agency still remains underrepresented for a lot of populations, disabled, LGBTQ+, older people, larger bodied people. And it's kind of like pleasure is a privilege only for conventionally attractive, heterosexual, able-bodied white people that follow these dominant like societal narratives. And the issue with that cultural idea and still this historical idea that sex is dangerous, inherently risky, can lead to overprotection of disabled people who are then often seen as childlike and incapable of reproduction or sex for pleasure. I just see something in the chat. Oh, thank you very much, Margaret. Awesome. Oh yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, a literature review of women living with intellectual disabilities found that the main barriers to sexual experience were actually a lack of accessible information, insufficient time to make decisions, a lack of support from significant others, and then inability to make their own decisions. So that autonomy piece, their own decisions free of coercion from parents, caregivers, or sexual partners. A good example is think of a group home for, say, people with intellectual disabilities. Do you think that the staff feel prepared or equipped or able to accommodate intimacy for the people that live there? And that's a big challenge. Same thing with seniors' homes. So the data does suggest it may be harder for disabled people to start and maintain long-term relationships than it is for non-disabled people. And this is from an article I also really like. Participant quotes are great. If you're fighting just to get your arse wiped, how do you even begin that dialogue with social services to talk about positioning for sex then? Are they going to see that as frivolous? And if you can't guarantee you're going to get up, be washed and fed, where on earth can you hope to look for a relationship? So these are very, very real issues people struggle with. And so how did we get here? Well, my experience doing STI nursing. I love syphilis. It's like, I just really like syphilis. I could do a whole lecture on it, and I have for nursing, but it's one of my passions. And so here's a quote. I'll just skip the first sentence. These acts led to the forcible examination and detainment of women suspected of being prostitutes, rather than focusing on men who were the ones spreading the infection. These women were often subjected to forced medical examinations and imprisonment if they were found to have syphilis, while men were not held to the same standard of scrutiny. The women, especially prostitutes, this was kind of like 1800s-ish, but it continued for a while. Women were blamed for spreading syphilis, and the medical treatment for women was more about controlling their behavior and preventing the spread of disease to men. So women weren't actually offered treatment. And so these women, as well as people with disabilities, were often forcibly sterilized, even without their knowledge. And this kind of feeds into we'll also think about it, the majority of people with pain are women, and a lot of disabilities are mostly females that experience them. Thanks, Margaret, for putting those in the chat. So historically, for a very, very long time, this is what has led to where we are now. Sexual pleasure was seen as disease, sin, or sickness, and non-procreative sexual activity was seen as sinful, and then later actually seen as a sign of sickness under the medical model of sexuality, especially in relation to marginalized groups. If we look at disability, disabled individuals were marginalized in systems where selling labor was mandatory. So if you couldn't participate in that, then what use are you to us? And then that led to some stigma. So yay, neoliberalism. If anyone ever does grad school, you'll learn a lot about that term. But physicians took on this kind of like moral role then, warning against premarital and extramarital sex, which I can understand from a public health standpoint before we had effective safe treatment and birth control. But then there's this idea, Foucault actually called it the abnormal individual. And so he said, pleasure in people who are labeled abnormal sexually, so by not following the heteronormative expectations, were threats to public health. And there was a period of history where masturbation was actually blamed for conditions like blindness and insanity. I don't think this was ever proven to be true, but we still don't know. But Kellogg's cornflakes were originally created by a doctor who believed that bland food would reduce people's urge to masturbate in the 1890s. And this was part of many anti-masturbation campaigns, so very much anti-pleasure. So even though we've seen progress in gender, ethnicity, and non-heterosexual diversity awareness, the disability discourse has barely shifted in public when you look at the literature. We have this idea that, or still, we follow this biological determinism. So that means in sex education, people with disabilities are often excluded because we focus on the reproductive aspect of sex. And current sexuality education fails to ensure the human rights of disabled students. And that includes the right to accessible and inclusive education. So most provincial, I don't know what it's like in BC, but most provincial sexuality education curriculum usually doesn't address disability or its intersection with sexuality and gender. And so it leaves a lot of people that don't fit this able-bodied standard without tailored educational content. And actually, Alberta last year moved to an opt-in model of sex education. So there's this general trend now we're moving away from proper sexual education in a lot of cases, that people need to be able to make decisions and feel confident. So other than hypersexual messages in the media, pleasure is often missing from that conversation, especially for people with disabilities. And this is another quote from the 1990s, and I don't think much has changed. So it's kind of talking about females. So a genuine discourse of desire, well, in general, how we need to have sex ed. So a genuine discourse of desire would invite adolescents to explore what feels good and bad, desirable and undesirable, grounded in experiences, needs, and limits. Such a discourse would release females from a position of receptivity, enable an analysis of the dialectics of victimization and pleasure, and repose female adolescents as subjects of sexuality, initiators as well as negotiators. And I think this is very much applicable to people with disabilities in general as well. So I want to talk about pleasure a bit more. So when we look at the literature, it's like, no, we know from the evidence sexual pleasure needs to be a core topic in disability studies, but it's often overlooked. So that anti-sex rhetoric in sex ed fails to promote sexual responsibility and instead contributes to higher rates of victimization, teen pregnancy, and dropout. Pleasure is often seen as a luxury or an addition to life rather than a central motivator of relationships and intimacy and connection and an affirmation of life. If you've ever heard, actually, this is another good show, Masters, called Masters and Johnson or Masters and Masters, but Virginia Johnson, one of the more original sex researchers, although I have issues with their model of sex, which is now out of date. Anyway, she describes sexual pleasure as something that makes us feel like complete human beings. And sexual pleasure is a powerful antidote to pain, both physically and emotionally, and it actually can have measurable analgesic effects. So when you look at chronic pain, consider that. Of course, it also fosters connectedness in relationships. It can help heal emotional isolation, and sex for people with disabilities can provide resistance to negative media messages that suggest we don't deserve pleasure. But the lack of focus on sexual pleasure does reflect a limited understanding by health professionals, where we're still much in that medical model of risk reduction, pregnancy prevention, not pleasure. And we need all of those things. So there's a pressing need for positivity in sexuality education, especially regarding disability, to combat some of the skewed perceptions and harmful stereotypes. where pleasure originally, remember, was seen as something that was very sinful. So then we get to what's called this orgasm imperative. And it goes back to, well, what actually is sex? What defines the act of sex? So sex research combined with media distortions has created this orgasm imperative where in our culture, orgasm is seen as like the ultimate goal of sexual activity. But for non-disabled people, what's interesting is these standards. So not desiring sex is labeled as hypoactive sexual desire disorder, and not reaching orgasm is diagnosed as an orgasm disorder that qualifies for treatment. So that's for non-disabled people. But in somebody with a disability experiences low sexual desire or can't orgasm, doesn't have orgasms, it's often not seen as problematic or worthy of treatment. So it's just like, well, yeah, you don't need to, you don't need to have sex or enjoy it. So there's this focus on genitals and performance. So the lack of quality sexuality education combined with learning about sex primarily through genital intercourse leads to a very narrow focus on genitals and sexual performance. And so orgasm remains as like this primary goal of sexual experiences in our culture. And it leaves out anyone that has sex outside of this idea. So it could be somebody who is a paraplegic and their genitals don't work, but they still have a right to sexual activity and intimacy if they so desire. Okay, before we move on to intersectionality, I just want to see if there's any questions. All right, moving on. Okay, so this is, okay, intersectionality. This is actually an AI image of a Black, queer, disabled woman. So that's 4 things right there that are frequently stigmatized, marginalized, or oppressed. I'm going to talk about gender and sexual minorities in the context of disability for now. This is from it's a little outdated now, 2020. But looking at this kind of, okay, people that are in the LGBTQ plus community, what kind of disabilities, what are the rates of disabilities? Basically, people that are 2X LGBTQ plus are more likely to be disabled than those that aren't in that one of those identities. And that speaks more to the multitudes of structural oppression because it doesn't make sense that there would be like a genetic difference that makes them more likely to be disabled, right? There's no gay gene, there's no straight gene. That's outdated. Sexuality is just complex, and so is having a disability. So if we look at the first column, anyone who's identifies as LGBTQ plus, they most commonly report actually having a cognitive disability. And that is, there's lots of studies on that. I could get into that. That could be a whole lecture, but about 1/4 of cisgendered LGBTQ plus adults and 1/3 of transgender adults report this, compared to less than 1 in 10 non-LGBTQ plus adults. So cognitive disabilities are the most common among young people. And this could also be due to the younger age in this sample of adults that identified as LGBTQ plus. But around disability, an interesting fact is that someone who's disabled in Canada who chooses marriage or cohabitation are actually often excluded then from the Canada Disability Benefit if their partner is able-bodied and working. So this moves disabled people out of financial independence into can be a forced dependence on their spouse, and that can be a prime that can lead to not being able to leave a situation if there's any sort of like abuse. And then we know that people that are gender minorities or sexual minorities are also at greater risk for spousal abuse and that kind of thing. So neurodivergent people, especially people with autism spectrum disorder, are also more likely to identify as LGBTQ plus than someone who's neurotypical, which is really interesting. So autistic folks are 8 times more likely to identify as a sexual minority, and 42 to 69% of people with autism spectrum disorder are attracted to the same sex, which is really fascinating. So there's this intersection sometimes around certain disabilities and sexual diversity, but LGBTQ plus individuals with chronic diseases face greater barriers or discrimination because we look at this layered oppression and stigmatization of all these intersecting identities. And existing research on the effects of chronic disease on LGBTQ plus sexuality is very limited, typically focusing only on the male sexual response. And so these studies neglect broader aspects of sexuality, particularly for females or someone who's maybe transgender, intersex. That's a big missing piece, as well as queer folks. And I think a good example is actually HIV PrEP and doxy-PEP. So those are medications that someone can take to prevent getting HIV or syphilis. And it's interesting because nearly all studies on these medications to prevent HIV and syphilis is done on men who have sex with men, due to it being often the type of sexual activity is higher risk for transmission, but also we see higher rates among that population. And there's almost, in people with vaginas, almost no research on that being done for the effectiveness or dosing recommendations of these medications, especially on what they call on demand. So just taking it around the sexual event versus day after day after day. So it's very interesting how things get left out sometimes, just depending on what population you belong to and kind of what we see as the greatest risk. But what about, people with vaginas? Maybe they're a sex worker that has a disability. And I'm going to talk about sex work and disability in a few slides here. So there's this dual discrimination when you're disabled and of a sexual minority because of these intersecting identities. So what we see is, yes, higher rates of school bullying that can lead to adverse outcomes like dropping out of school, increased discrimination in healthcare settings. So that can lead someone to avoid care and then have unmet health needs, and then a greater likelihood of facing poverty and higher unemployment. And so, when we look at the prevalence of disability among sexual minorities, especially transgender, they are significantly more likely to report having at least one disability. And over half of transgender adults self-report a disability. So looking at, nature, nurture, environment, all the social determinants of health, how does that contribute? And the more different identities we layer, how do we see that play out in society as well, and access to healthcare around sexuality? And then within these populations, people can often also face discrimination. So for somebody who may say, I'm a gay man, there's reported problematic ideals of bodies, beauty, and appearance in the gay community that might marginalize disabled gay men. Some gay men with intellectual disabilities report feeling like they're kind of at the bottom of the gay pecking order, was a quote I saw in a study. For women that have sex with women, they tend to be, they're disabled, desexualized, and undervalued in lesbian circles. And they also face homophobia and heterosexism in the disability community. So then it's like, well, where would you belong? We can look at asexual people. So unfortunately, efforts to depathologize asexuality often distance it from disability, which can kind of lead to like an erasure of asexual disabled people. So it's important not to label people with disabilities as asexual, but some actually are asexual, and that is a sexual identity. And then with transgendered folks, there's very, very limited research on trans people in general, but especially on trans disabled people. Most of the attention is then on lesbian or gay or bisexual disabled people. And then what happens is we kind of end up having this like conflation or mix up of what's gender identity and what's sexual orientation, just kind of lumping everything together. So in trans studies, there tends to be an ableist bias. And then in disability studies, we see a cisnormative bias. So there's a lot of issues we need to work out in the academic field as well. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about race for a sec, and then sex work, and then we'll wrap up. So the intersection of disability, sexuality, and then race results in even more layered oppressions. Think back to that AI image that I had to generate. Well, I didn't do it. I found it online. About just 4 things that are all separately stigmatized. So there's really a need for more intersectional research that takes into account how these complex interlocking systems of oppression, like ableism, sexism, racism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, shape the day-to-day lived experiences of people living with any of those identities. And so people that are disabled, that are also members of a marginalized racial or ethnic group, or that are queer face compounded discrimination in basic human things like housing, healthcare access, education, and even in employment. And disabled women of color, especially, experience heightened challenges in accessing reproductive health services and achieving that autonomy. So, the health outcomes for this aspect of multiple identities still remains very, very poor. Okay, I'm going to talk about sex work and disability, which is kind of my latest focus in my research. It's fascinating. So, here's a quote I like quotes. This constant desexualization is why I started making porn. I first started taking dirty pictures of myself as a way to finally see my body, myself, as hot and sexy. I started making porn to expose people to bodies that flaunt asymmetrical curves, bodies that move differently than the non-disabled desirable norm. I started making porn to give other queer crips a chance to see something a little closer to their lives depicted on screen. I love how it causes rupture. Ideally, people can no longer pity or patronize me after they know I make porn. And that's a participant from a research study. So there's two sides to sex work and disability. There's people that live with disabilities that engage in sex work and are sex workers. And then there's people that have disabilities that access or are a patron of sex work. So we'll start with the first one. 73% of sex workers surveyed in this, it was one Canadian study, said, yeah, I live with a disability. And many people with disabilities face workplace discrimination and lack of accommodation. So they might not be able to work like a normal job. And so engaging in sex work can actually offer financial autonomy, affirmation, and even pleasure. Some turn to sex work or pornography as a way to reclaim their sexual identity, feel empowered, challenge societal norms, and also give other disabled people a chance to see their own experiences reflected if they do engage in porn or like film, and to kind of rupture these societal norms that pity or patronize disabled people. So then we can talk about a couple terms, sexual citizenship, it being one, and that's linked to sexual assistance, which is really a key part of the agenda for people living with certain disabilities in order to achieve sexual citizenship. So sexual citizenship, there's three dimensions to the concept we see right now. So it has to do with whether you have access to and you're given control, so over your own body, feelings, and relationships. Do you have access to representations, relationships, and public spaces? And do you have choice about identities, lifestyle, and gender experiences? And that's kind of what we see as necessary to achieving this idea of sexual citizenship, which many able-bodied folks probably take for granted. So it's also similar to an older term called intimate citizenship, and that's still similar. So focuses on control over the body and emotions, access to social spaces, and choices in erotic and gender experiences. So then what's sexual assistance? It's not a give and take relationship, and we don't see this really much in Canada, legally at least, but it aims to support people with disability sexual needs, but it doesn't imply reciprocity. It's the same way that necessarily sex work or, well, anyways, it's a service, right? So it can be full service, or it can just be you have someone help move the person into the right position to have sex with someone else. It can also be sex counseling. So in other countries, there's different terms used, but one is sexual volunteers. So there's in Taiwan, a group that it's a team that offers comprehensive services around screening, needs assessments for people with disabilities, and sometimes service delivery. And then countries like Denmark, Germany, and I think the Netherlands, have actually integrated this idea of sexual assistance into public policies. And they've trained social workers to be able to like be sexual advisors for people with disabilities, which is really interesting because this is not something OT a little bit does that here, but it's very niche. Sexual assistance, so then what it does is it promotes this sex positive equity idea of interventions, and it counters kind of ableist constraints and can really provide people living with disabilities autonomy over their sexual lives. There was a story I read, it was in a research article, and it was a man who was able to, he lives in Europe, he was able to get funding to have a sex worker trained in people with disabilities come once a month to his house and, you know, be intimate with him. and his number of hospital visits related to physical pain dropped by like 50%. So it's really interesting. Okay, so then I'm going to talk about crip theory for a minute, just briefly. This is something you might see in the literature. I was coined by Robert McCruer, who has some good literature out there, but merges disability studies with queer theory and to challenge able-bodied and heteronormative assumptions. So really, if you ever go on to graduate school, you'll probably see this, but it examines how certain identities become representative while others are excluded. And the example I always think of is, okay, anytime I see a company that's like, we are looking to hire diverse people, we support people with disabilities. It's always a person in a wheelchair. And so I question why, I mean, I kind of understand, but why the most common representation we see for disabled people is someone in a wheelchair. Why are they represented while others are excluded? I guess it's a physical cue someone's disabled for sure, but something that you could look at under the lens of crip theory. So key concepts to crip theory is that it reclaims this term crip, which was very derogatory for someone who's disabled, and now promotes pride in disabled identity. Kind of like you might see, it's a little bit older now, but reclaiming the word slut to be a positive term. It also critiques the assumptions of able-bodiedness and the compulsory heterosexuality, and introduces the term disabling sex, which challenges conventional sexual norms and kind of frames non-normative sexuality as resistant and liberatory. And then if you ever get into this in the research field, you might see the term cripistemology, which is a take on the word epistemology, essentially meaning like how and who studies knowledge and according to who. So cripistemologies, kind of like just like critical disability lenses, really center embodied knowledge and lived experience of disabled people, and question how disability is represented and understood in society, and also by whom. So this crip theory reframes disability and sexuality as sites of resistance and creativity and power. Okay, I think this is almost my last content slide here. So I do need to mention disability and kink because it's something I discovered when I started looking into the research, that there's a huge overlap. And this is where we really see pleasure, pain, and power all come together. For some people with disabilities, kink can be a very rich way to reclaim their sexuality. And it's a place, if they have pain, where pain isn't something that's just being treated or managed, but it's something they can choose and control and even experience pleasure from. So many people with disabilities describe kink or BDSM as a way to reclaim agency over their bodies and to really move from being acted on in medical spaces to being in control of sensation and touch. And it's also one of the few sexual subcultures that very, very much prioritizes and emphasizes consent, negotiation, and communication. And that can be really, really important for people that have disabilities with special accommodations and fluctuating pain levels. Research does show that some people with chronic pain find temporary relief of their chronic pain through BDSM play, partly because it allows the nervous system to reinterpret pain as sensation rather than suffering. Of course, it's not without risk. So, it would require adaptation, pacing, and individual awareness of limits, but it can open up possibilities for some people for pleasure, connection, and power, rather than curing or correcting the body. I'll just kind of mention technology before I wrap up. So I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Her. It's definitely older now. But it's interesting how we're almost seeing this come. I mean, I think this is probably almost 20 years old, this movie. I don't know. But basically in the movie, I'm not going to play the clip because might be a bit racy, but it kind of really illustrates sex and digital technology and AI, and that intersection, which we're now seeing. Basically, in this case, the man falls in love with his AI operating system because she can talk, and it escalates to like a sexual experience, and he falls in love with her, but she has like 800 other people that she does this with. Anyways, even though there's no physical presence, their exchange kind of demonstrates how technology can simulate an emotionally charged sexual experience. So it's like, well, do you need a embodied orgasm? I don't know. But now what we're seeing is all kinds of AI things related to sex, including AI porn, apparently. There's Kindred, where you can like customize an AI bot that will do exactly what you want, can call you on the phone and you can have a conversation with them. People make AI girlfriends or boyfriends. And then we also know now with deepfakes that people can create AI porn based on people they know in real life, which is another very scary but interesting topic. But technology can be positive. And so for people with disabilities, there are many positive benefits to, for example, dating apps or something where you have the control over how and when you disclose your disability. And that can give people more autonomy in forming relationships. Some people engage in like virtual worlds where you can, have an opportunity to pretend that you're able-bodied, I guess, and participate and express your sexual identity through a virtual world. And so sometimes engaging in these things can enhance someone's self-esteem and quality of life and offers people with disabilities a sense of equality in spaces that might otherwise not be accessible. I'm very curious to see where the future of AI goes and its application to the concepts of sexual citizenship and sexual assistance. Okay, I lied. I have one more slide and then I'll wrap up. Mainly interventions in this area need to be individual and contextualized. So there's no one size fits all approach because there's no one size fits all disability and it affects everybody differently, right? But there are some consistent themes about what actually makes a difference. So comprehensive sexual education that includes disability and pleasure. When young people, disabled or not, learn that disabled people can and do have sex, it can begin to dismantle that stigma for very early on in someone's life. We do need healthcare provider training. Most providers just don't have the education or confidence in discussing sexuality with people who have disabilities or chronic pain. And then managing the disability itself is important. So through medical, it can be through occupational therapy, pain management, medical review, can help actually improve sexual functioning and quality of life. So that medical piece is still very much important. And then we talked about sexual assistance programs. While they can be controversial, they do recognize sexuality as a right, not a privilege. And then there are some assistive technologies as well. So adaptive devices, sex aids, digital tools that can be really empowering for people that live with physical limitations or chronic pain. I don't know if you've ever seen the Netflix series, I think it's Netflix, Grace and Frankie. I always think of how they designed vibrators for people with arthritis in their hands. And that's the thing, that just need a little bit of adaptation and you're good. And then finally, counseling and therapy is very much important, not just for the individual, but also for couples if somebody is coupled. So these are just a couple of resources. If you're really into this topic, the University of Alberta, in conjunction with the Alberta Society for the Promotion of Sexual Health, so ASFISH, offers a postgraduate certificate in sexual health. And one of the 4 courses is specifically on sexuality, illness, and disability. As I mentioned in my disclosures, I am the president for the Alberta Society for the Promotion of Sexual Health. What we do is we offer online workshops and education sessions for people across Canada and also all over the world, because most of them are either hybrid or virtual. I'm actually offering a workshop starting October 20th that delves a bit deeper into chronic pain, sexuality, and disabled sexuality, more around clinical. So a bit more for practitioners, less theory. So feel free to sign up. We give rates to students. And then we're also having a conference in Calgary late April next year. So if you're interested in sexual health, it's a great way to network and try to get into the field. This is a good online website. They offer a lot of free online courses focused on intellectual disabilities and sex. These are some of my favorite books. McCruer is the third from the left that I mentioned, that kind of crip theory and all that, really good. And then the Alice Wong book on the right is really, really good. It's very engaging and easy to read. Their essays written by people. Just some other links. And then, in conclusion, the pursuit of sexuality and sexual happiness, regardless of what one's body looks like, is really a fundamental human right. So people with disabilities must have the power to define sexuality for themselves. Sex is complex, but it's a multidisciplinary task. Really doesn't need to fall between professions. We can all take responsibility for addressing this on our work and practice. And just remembering that people with disabilities are sexual too, and we need to emphasize those sex positive approaches to help them express and explore their sexuality without societal judgment. So thank you very much. And yeah, if there's questions, I'm happy to take any questions, comments. Happy to take any. You can learn more about me on my website.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Janice. As Janice said, please go ahead. Anybody have any questions for Janice?
Yeah, Alex has a question. Yay.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to say thank you. I am diagnosed with endometriosis and I've gone through the medical system, and I found this super eye-opening because I am wanting to kind of do my master's in counseling and focus on supporting folks with endometriosis. And I guess within my own personal journey, the whole sexual part of it was very much focused on, making sure that I don't have pain so I can one day have a baby kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And then also there was never any discussion of, adapting different ways of, sexual health and sexual pleasure. Like it was only focused on penetrative sex. And I've been to physio, I've been, to multiple doctors, right? And also just like pain management through that sexual experience too, right? And even just having that connection. So this kind of just really opened my eyes to incorporating what you talked about into my own practice, personally and professionally. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, thank you, Alex, and for sharing your story. I'm so sorry that was your experience, but again, just highlights absolutely how we all need to take this on and talk about it and reimagine these ideas that we grew up with on what sex is and what the focus and the point of sex is, right? And yeah, I mean, that's some of my master's research or my PhD research now is what I see as sexual health clinics aren't able to, not equipped to, there's a lot of reasons, but don't address pain and disability. But then if you go to seek chronic pain or disability care, they often don't address sexuality adequately. So there's this kind of who takes it on? And right now there's nobody. I think it's all of us. So I really look forward to hearing, about your master's. That'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Stacy.
Need to unmute Stacy.
Can't hear you, Stacy. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So in my experience, I'm a person living with cerebral palsy. There's there's a lack of like specialized clinics for people with disabilities. Like there's one in BC at BC Women's, and where they have like the beds that lower and the stirrups that are more, I guess, adaptable, and nurses who actually know how to work with disabled bodies. But there's like, this is the only service, I think, at least in Metro Vancouver. But people are talking about this more, so I'm curious as to whether or not you see like there's more of a need, or if there'll be more services like this coming, because it's so much, like it's really needed. And yeah, so I'm just curious to what your thoughts are.
Yeah. I think there's more awareness. The awareness is increasing, but I'm not seeing it so much in practice or services being offered. I mean, in Alberta, our healthcare system is under a lot of threats right now, and we've had a lot of funding around sexual health resources cut. So it's unfortunate right now that these two, the sexual health piece and then also disability piece, are very stigmatized if we look at our current political climate with our neighbor down south. I think the awareness is good. The awareness is getting better, but it's not being enacted so much yet. And I'm thinking, like, how can we innovate ways considering how strapped we often are for resources in healthcare? But I think it's like, I would love to see like maybe a consult, like a clinical champion that goes around and helps clinics be more accessible or something, versus having to like create standalone clinics that focus on people with disabilities, but maybe someone they could call and be like, help us, come to our site. There's a need, we need help, versus, I don't know. I'm not sure. That's why I'm going into this research, obviously, but I just appreciate you sharing your experience. And I didn't know about that clinic because I practice in Alberta, but I don't know of anything in where I live in Alberta that has even anything like that. Like often when I do STI testing in the community as a nurse, like people that are wheelchair users, I have to go to their house. We don't have a
Oh,
place in our
wow.
clinic that has a bed that would work. Like we don't have a mechanical lift. We don't have like, it's like, okay, but our community health nurses that do STI testing are very, very limited, right? So
Yeah, yeah. And like just when I was younger, when I first went for my first like screening, they had no idea how to work with me. So I
yeah,
and like I and had I not been able to research and find this clinic, I would have not been able to have had that service as someone
yeah,
who is sexually active. And it's just
yeah.
really unfortunate. Like if it's somebody with an intellectual disability who doesn't know how to seek
That
out
can't
supports
advocate or
and
do the
services.
research.
Yeah, it's really,
When it leaves them at risk because then you're not having regular screening.
yeah,
You're not getting that in person. You're not also receiving then counseling and education when you do go in, right?
yeah, yeah.
And then, yeah, people are left behind. There is a lab in Calgary that just started. They're doing research. It's a disability and sexuality lab. Their focus is mostly on intellectual disabilities, which is fantastic. But kind of my complaint is most of the disability sexuality work that's being done is around specifically intellectual disabilities. And if it's a physical disability, it's like, it's again, that disability hierarchy. It tends to be like, okay, you're an excellent athlete that's now a paraplegic or something. Like,
Yeah,
I don't, not the more diverse cerebral palsy or the
yeah,
other kinds of physical disabilities we see. So there's a lot
yeah,
of work to be done. And I think it's everybody's responsibility, but I'm not seeing a huge change in practice yet. Not in
yeah.
Alberta.
It's so unfortunate because disabilities like cerebral palsy, they're actually really common. So,
Prevalent. Yeah.
um, yeah, it's unfortunate. I hope that change is put forward in the near
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. And it's a lot to ask on people with disabilities to take that on themselves. So I think we all need to play a part as well as like,
Yeah,
you can do what you can in your work and try to make a difference, but it can't just fall on the people that live with disabilities, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stacy.
You're welcome.
Anybody else like to ask a question? I will be posting the recording. So fortunately, this is just going to be an amazing presentation for the other students to be able to review. And I just can't say enough about how much I've appreciated everything that you put into this presentation. I'm sure all of us are just really overwhelmed with the
Yes.
complexity. And wow, it's a fantastic topic. Um, so
Yeah.
much of, so there's so much in there I can hardly comment. Just your references, your slides, your images, your quotes, of course. And wow, being a nurse myself, I'm very proud that you're doing this work, and it shows you what nursing can do. Um,
Yeah.
so thank you so much, Janice. I sure appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
And you have your website posted as well, and that's on our announcements page. But
Great. Yeah. People are welcome to reach out and ask questions. And I might, if you're
mhm,
able to send me a copy of the recording, Margaret, that would
sure.
be great as
Yeah, I
well
will for sure.
when it's ready. Thank
Okay,
you so
thank
much
you.
for having me. Hey, take care,
Okay,
everyone.
Thank you.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Michelle. First on and last to go.